Welcome, I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is Your Call. Before we begin today's show, we want to let you know that we will be discussing sexual assault. Abortion rights and Donald Trump's abortion bans have played a major role at the Democratic National Convention. On the first night of the convention, 3 women shared their harrowing experiences with pregnancy, miscarriage, and abortion. Texas resident Amanda Zarowski spoke alongside her husband Josh about how she became pregnant after months of fertility treatments, only to have her pregnancy declared not viable at 18 weeks. Amanda was denied an abortion, as Texas law only allows the procedure if the mother's life is deemed to be in danger. She had to wait 3 days to be declared sick enough with sepsis to receive treatment. Sepsis is a life-threatening condition. She spent the next 3 days in the ICU fighting for her life. Luckily, she survived, but the infection caused one of her fallopian tubes to become permanently closed, compromising her future ability to have children. She had no choice but to turn to in vitro fertilization, or IVF, to start a family. Here is Amanda Zarowski sharing her story at the Democratic National Convention.
Every time I share our story, my heart breaks. For the baby girl we wanted desperately, for the doctors and nurses who couldn't help me deliver her safely, for Josh, who feared he would lose me too. But I was lucky. I lived. So I'll continue sharing our story, standing with women and families across the country. Today, because of Donald Trump, more than 1 in 3 women of reproductive age in America lives under an abortion ban. A second Trump term would rip away even more of our rights. Passing a national abortion ban, letting states monitor pregnancies and prosecute doctors, restricting birth control and fertility treatments. We cannot let that happen. We need to vote as if lives depend on it, because they do.
Amanda Zarowski sued the state of Texas over the lack of clarity in their medical abortion exemption law. In May, the Texas Supreme Court threw out the case. Caitlin Joshua suffered a miscarriage in Louisiana, a state with a total abortion ban.
2 years ago, my husband and I were expecting our second child. Our daughter, Lauren, couldn't wait to be a big sister. I was getting ready for her 4th birthday party when something didn't feel right. 2 emergency rooms sent me away. Because of Louisiana's abortion ban, no one would confirm that I was miscarrying. I was in pain, bleeding so much my husband feared for my life. No woman should experience what I endured, but too many have. They write to me saying, "What happened to you happened to me." Sometimes they're miscarrying, scared to tell anyone, even their doctors. Our daughters deserve better. America deserves better.
Kentucky also has a near total abortion ban. Hadley Duvall spoke about the importance of abortion as an option for victims of sexual assault. Hadley Duvall is a survivor.
I was raped by my stepfather after years of sexual abuse. At age 12, I took my first pregnancy test, and it was positive. That was the first time I was ever told, you have options. I can't imagine not having a choice. But today, that's the reality for many women and girls across the country because of Donald Trump's abortion bans. He calls it a beautiful thing. What is so beautiful about a child having to carry her parent's child? There are other survivors out there who have no options. And I want you to know that we see you. We hear you.
These speeches were some of the most powerful moments of the convention so far, and the messaging at the convention is very clear. If you want to support abortion access, you must vote for Kamala Harris. Harris has made reproductive rights a central component of her campaign, and she's been traveling the country, hearing from people who've been affected by extreme abortion bans in Republican-controlled states. Joining us to talk about all of this are two guests. Alice Ollstein is a healthcare reporter for Politico. One of her latest pieces is called Harris Wants to Restore Roe. For many activists, that is not enough. Hi, Alice. Thank you for joining us. Renee Bracey Sherman is founder and executive director of We Testify, an organization dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions and share their stories at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity. Renee Bracey Sherman is co-host of the podcast The A-Files, A Secret History of Abortion, and executive producer of Ours to Tell, an award-winning documentary elevating the voices of people who've had abortions. She is co-author of the book Liberating Abortion, which comes out in October. Hi, Renee. Thank you so much for joining us. And we should say you are in Chicago.
Hi, thank you. Yes, calling in from my hometown and the DNC. Thank you for having me.
Well, great to have you. I want to ask both of you a somewhat big question, but I think it's very important because things are moving so fast these days. So this decision by Republican Supreme Court justices came down 2 years ago, and so much has changed since then. We now have 14 total bans in Republican-controlled states. We have heard so many harrowing stories. There are so many stories we have not heard and will never hear. So I just wonder for both of you, what really stands out for you when you look at how much has changed over the past 2 years? Renee, let's start with you.
Yeah, I've been in the DNC, the convention each night, and the feeling is electric. And as an abortion storyteller and one of the architects of this moment in which abortion stories are a part of the conversation, I've been doing this work for 15 years. And it's really exciting. I remember, when I started doing this work that we couldn't tell abortion stories. It needs to be private. We shouldn't talk about that. Abortion, we can't say the word. That it's actually a third rail issue. We need to welcome anti-abortion Democrats into the party. That was the argument that was being made. And we kept pushing back, saying, no, Americans love abortion access. 1 in 4 of us will have an abortion. If we talk about it, if we stop using language like safe, legal, and rare, if we stop allowing anti-abortion Democrats to call the shot in this party, we can actually win. Abortion wins elections. It turns people out. And that is what we're seeing. It's really frustrating that it has taken for Roe to fall, for us to understand that, and for Democrats to understand that and to make it the central issue in this DNC. But it's really beautiful to see all of the stories being part of it, having center stage, and in every speech that elected officials and politicians are making, they are making the case that abortion is essential to American families and all of us across this country. My hope is that it's not just here's what anti-abortion politicians did, but also here's what we're going to do to move forward. Because I do think that it's not accurate to just put this on Republicans, because, the one storyteller spoke about the Louisiana ban. Well, Governor John Bel Edwards is a Democrat. So I think we have to do the work to recognize how Democrats have been part of this anti-abortion stigma over the years. And again, not just defend against abortion bans, but say, here's how we're going to make abortion truly accessible for all this time.
This is such a good point, and I really would love both of you also in just a few minutes to talk about how the Democrats have really lost on this issue. Before we do that, though, Alice, what are your thoughts? What has really stood out for you when you look at what has changed in the past 2 years?
Absolutely. So, in addition to the political upheaval, Renee was mentioning on the Democratic side, I mean, we've been tracking this on both sides. It's sort of two sides of the same coin, where you hear the Democrats being way more emboldened on this issue, talking about it in different terms, talking about it as a healthcare issue, as a fundamental freedom, not being as hesitant around it, advocating for policies that you didn't see them advocate for before, like getting rid of the Hyde Amendment, which bans federal funding on abortion. And so as they're moving in this direction, Republicans are, people like to say they're the dog that caught the car. They were very loud on this issue for so long, saying we're against abortion, we're against Roe v. Wade. And now that they have achieved a lot of what they wanted and experienced this big political backlash that you're seeing in, red and blue states alike, that you suddenly don't hear them talking about it as much. We're in the middle of the DNC, where, as Renee said, this is front and center. This is on the main stage. At the RNC, almost nothing about abortion, which is a big change from the past. And in addition to the political, revolution we're seeing on both sides, we're also tracking the healthcare impacts of this, which are just vast and sometimes surprising, sometimes predictable. Folks may not know that actually the total number of abortions in the U.S. has actually gone up since Roe versus Wade was overturned, despite all of these state bans, because of a lot of innovations in telemedicine and a lot of activists who are working to get abortion medication to people who want it. But at the same time, a lot of people can't access that and are continuing pregnancies that they might not have continued otherwise, and that's having healthcare repercussions. And so just so many different trends to keep an eye on.
To that point, Alice, something that we bring up a lot on the show is that while it's so brave for the women that we heard earlier, like Amanda Zarowski or Caitlin Joshua, to share stories about the babies that they so desperately wanted, and yet they had a problem, a couple months in, and they could not get the help they want because of these extreme bans. We're hearing a lot about that. What we're not hearing so much about is the people who just got pregnant and don't want to be pregnant. And I ask the guests this question every time. Do we have any sense of how often this is happening? That people who just do not want to be pregnant are being forced to have children for whatever reason. They can't afford to travel. I mean, there's so many different hurdles here. They don't know that pills are available. We're just not hearing about those people as much, Alice. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really hard to get that data. And, we've seen a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence of this. We've seen some very powerful individual stories being told. We've seen lawsuits where people in these states with bans are becoming plaintiffs, challenging the bans and talking about how it's affected them. But you're right in that generally in politics, only one kind of abortion story is lifted up, and it is these stories of medical complications in wanted pregnancies. And you don't see as much people being lifted up who are talking about just having an abortion because it was their choice, even though choice has been such a sort of tentpole word in the past. And so, there are calls for, a greater diversity of stories, because there's a fear that this could create a perception that there are quote unquote good and bad abortions and further stigmatize the people who just simply don't want to be pregnant.
Renee, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the work that I do, right? We work with folks who've had abortions, share their abortion stories, particularly at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity. The majority of people who have abortions are people of color. The majority of people who have abortions already have children. The majority of people who have abortions, it is because they simply did not want to be pregnant. And I mean the majority in that it's over 90%, right? So what is a challenge is that we're seeing this distorted view of there's sort of the exceptions, and they're elevating these stories because they want to explain to people, hey, this is really like, this is what's at stake. We can all agree that these folks in these situations should have abortions. But what actually makes my job really difficult, and is difficult for myself as someone who had an abortion at 19 because I didn't want to be pregnant, and all of the abortion storytellers and all the people who are listening, if you don't have this story that is this exception, this reasoning, then it's almost like your story shouldn't matter, or that it's not the most compelling is the word we hear a lot. And it makes people not really want to share their abortion stories because they're like, oh, well, if mine's just a regular story, no one wants to hear it. All of your abortion stories matter. And I think that it's really important. What I want to see is the Democratic Party, the DNC, actually show myriad stories, all the different experiences, because that is who voters are. That is who has abortions. I will also say, the DNC and the Democratic Party, there's a lot of conversation about strengthening the middle class. There's so much language about the middle class, but the majority of people who have abortions are living at or just above the federal poverty level, right? They're actually having abortions because they cannot afford to have an additional child, or they do not want to, right? 75%. What needs to happen is we actually need to start talking about what low-income folks are experiencing. How are we actually strengthening what the world looks like, or what lives look like for folks? And that includes access to abortion, but also reproductive justice, right? The ability for them to be able to parent without fear of police harming their children, or without wondering where the food is going to come from, right? There needs to be a better class conversation, because right now it's very focused on like a middle class or upper middle class married folks. And us Black and brown folks, low income folks, have abortions too. Our voices deserve to be on that stage as well.
This is such a great point. I was wondering if things might change with Kamala Harris and her messaging, because I did notice in one of her first ads, she did talk about childhood poverty, and it kind of stopped me in my tracks because it's very rare to hear the word poverty. And I wondered if we were going to hear it more. But you're right, Renee. Once again, we're just hearing about the middle class. And in this day and age, what does that even mean, given that so many people in this country make less than $17 an hour and struggle to make ends meet?
I mean, okay, if you just do the math, everyone who's listening right now, do the math on your calculator on your phone, right? $17 an hour. If the average abortion, if a first trimester abortion costs between, $350 to $500, or sometimes $750, right? Depending on where you live. And that doesn't even factor in how much it costs to get to the nearest clinic, childcare, a hotel stay, food, all of those things, gas, right? That is $17 an hour. It's going to take you weeks and weeks and weeks to save up, as you're also taking care of the children that you already have, right? And then that is actually a barrier in and of itself that pushes people later into pregnancy, where abortion is less accessible and it's more expensive. This is why we are like, yes, I hear you on that. You want to use this Restore Roe talking point because you think it works well. But those of us who actually do the work on the ground to help people get abortions, or who have had abortions, know that what you're saying when you say Restore Roe is restore the bare minimum with a struggle. And I'm saying we need to actually liberate abortion for real this time, where we make sure that people are able to get abortions without that hustle, without those barriers, economic, not just the legal ones, right? And I want to say, what is that visionary plan to ensure that people are able to get abortions in their community? Because people were traveling while Roe was still the law of the land, right? People were still being denied abortions. And I think something you asked about earlier, we're not really hearing from people who were forced to continue their pregnancies. Well, part of it is because there's a stigma around saying, I wanted an abortion, but I couldn't get one. And so now I have this child. So that's a challenging thing. But we actually do have a lot of data about what that looked like pre-Roe falling. The Turnaway study out of the University of California, San Francisco, and it's a fantastic book by Diana Green Foster. Everyone should read it. They interviewed folks who wanted abortions but weren't able to get them. And they were more likely to be living in poverty. They were more likely to be struggling. They loved their children, but also it was a struggle. And they didn't have the choices that they wanted to have and to be able to plan their families. And I would love for us to have a larger conversation about what that looks like. And if people are being denied abortions, which we know is happening, what are we as a society doing to support them to raise those children? I was so glad to see that Vice President Harris has announced the $6,000 tax credit for a newborn. But what if we actually just gave people $6,000 cash? Or, oh my gosh, what about $12,000 cash, right? For that first year, $1,000 a month or even more, right? How can we actually fix the economic position for folks who are struggling and having babies and they need the support? We're so focused on giving them a tax rebate instead of actually just giving them the cash that they need to be able to care for their families. And to me, that is a reproductive justice policy that I would like to see that is both supportive of people building their families and also identifies when people are seeking abortion, what's actually at stake there. They don't have the money that they need. So let's just give it to them. Let's make sure that we support their families.
Alice, what are your thoughts on that? Given that you write about these issues and then read articles about these issues, what Renee is laying out there goes hand in hand. Race, class, the fact that so many low-income people are being forced to have children that they do not want for whatever reason, and yet the social safety net has been so shredded that there's, depending on where they live and what state they live. I mean, heck, even in California, it's hard to get help. It's so hard to make ends meet depending on where you live in the state of California. But what about connecting those dots? Are you hearing high profile politicians who are connecting these dots?
I am. And I think there is, more focus recently on the fact that a lot of the states that are banning abortion in almost all circumstances are also some of the same states that haven't expanded Medicaid and haven't expanded it specifically for postpartum women. So I think there is a focus on, the economic side of this, the healthcare side of this. But I think what's interesting are, the tensions on both sides. You're seeing a lot of disagreements within the anti-abortion movement and within the abortion rights movement on the best way to move forward right now. And so, even as the DNC is this, rah-rah moment of unity, we are digging into these policy disagreements and what folks really want to see going forward.
And before we go to break, just to let listeners know, so Alice reports that Kamala Harris has clarified her stance on these issues, and she is sticking with President Biden's call to restore Roe, which protected abortion up to fetal viability around 22 to 24 weeks and allowed mandatory waiting periods and targeted regulations on clinics that forced many to close. Alexis McGill Johnson, who's now the president of Planned Parenthood, said starting at Roe is the wrong framework. It was never grounded in justice. It was grounded in gestation, state interest, and burden. None of those principles are connected with how pregnancy and privacy decisions work. So what are your thoughts on this? We keep hearing from the Democratic Party that they're going to restore Roe, but so many activists say that is not enough. What are your thoughts? We'd love to hear from you. You can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. Alice Ollstein is a healthcare reporter with Politico. One of her latest pieces is called Harris Wants to Restore Roe. For many activists, that is not enough. Renee Bracey Sherman is founder and executive director of We Testify, an organization dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions and share their stories at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity. She's co-host of the podcast The A Files, A Secret History of Abortion, and executive producer of Ours to Tell, an award-winning documentary elevating the voices of people who've had abortions. She's co-author of the book Liberating Abortion, which comes out in October. This is Your Call. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. Today we are talking about the Democratic Party and abortion. Abortion is playing a central role at the Democratic National Convention. On the first night, 3 women shared their harrowing experiences with pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion, and sexual assault. The messaging at the DNC is clear. Vote for Kamala Harris if you support access to abortion. Kamala Harris says she wants to restore Roe, but many activists say that is not enough. So what are your thoughts on this? And what are your thoughts on what you've heard at the DNC around abortion so far? And also the Democratic Party and how we got to this place where abortion is now illegal in 14 states and then restricted in many more. Alice Ollstein is healthcare reporter for Politico. Renee Bracey Sherman is founder and executive director of We Testify. Her book, Liberating Abortion, comes out in October. Now let's talk a bit about the Democratic Party and how we got here. Renee, you talked a bit about this earlier in the show. Whenever this comes up, I think about an op-ed that Cecile Richards, the former president of Planned Parenthood, wrote for the New York Times. And I should say that Cecile Richards is dealing with brain cancer, which is just so horrific. She wrote an incredible story about her experience in the cut. In this New York Times op-ed, she wrote, "If I have one regret from my time leading Planned Parenthood, it is that we believed that providing vital health care with public opinion on our side would be enough to overcome the political onslaught. I underestimated the callousness of the Republican Party and its willingness to trade off the rights of women for political expediency." So there's Cecile Richards, former president of Planned Parenthood. And we could spend hours talking about the Democrats and what they did to lead us to this place. But what are your thoughts on this? What stands out for you the most?
Yeah, Cecile is a friend, and I actually saw her yesterday, and it was really great to see her do the roll call for Texas. And she's also shared her abortion story quite publicly. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned. She and I have had many conversations over the years. But I think one of the things that I think we can still correct now is that Democrats needed to really understand actually how they greased the slide to make this happen. And I know it gets a lot of people upset to hear me say this, and that's fine. You can yell at me online, but I just say, just listen to my podcast. I explain it all. Read my book. I explain it all. But when they didn't fight back on abortion early on, after we got Roe v. Wade, right? They sort of allowed folks like Bill Clinton to say that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. We didn't, like, the Democrats were okay with welfare to work policies, all of these other things that actually affected a lot of different reproductive decisions, right? But so long as the politicians that we supported called themselves pro-choice, we were fine with it. And that is how we got to a point where we have a president right now who wouldn't say the word abortion until Roe was overturned. I know because I started the website, didbidenssayabortionyet.org, keeping an eye on it, right? We've launched an entire campaign to get him to say the word abortion. That's such a bare minimum to say the word abortion. And yet it kind of is just this I don't know, metaphor for what had happened with Democrats for so long. They felt like, okay, well, as long as we don't, we can stop the extreme abortion bans, we'll be fine. But they didn't realize or didn't address that making abortion central to their politics, stopping against the little abortion bans that happened along the way were the cracks that made Roe fall. There is no difference between a simple abortion ban and an extreme abortion ban. All abortion restrictions are extreme because they mean that someone cannot get the care that they need, and it is the route towards a larger abortion ban. And so I think that they didn't pay attention to that. My hope, and what I constantly preach about, is that they need to actually understand, to fix this moment, we need to go big, we need to go bold. We cannot say we're going to restore Roe. And even if we did restore Roe, which part? Because there was Roe right after Roe was decided, right? But then there was Roe that was destroyed by Planned Parenthood v. Casey in the 1990s, which gave us the undue burden test, which allowed a lot of these restrictions. Or there's the version of Roe that was basically decimated in Texas once the SB 8 bounty hunter law went into effect in the ban there. So that all happened while Roe was in place. Roe was imperfect. And yes, I get that people are like, oh, it's shorthand for legalizing abortion. But at this point, legalization is not the only thing. We actually need to go for full liberation, full decriminalization, because we cannot have anyone fearing that if they self-manage their abortions, that they will be arrested. We cannot have anyone being denied an abortion later in pregnancy. We need abortion at any time and for any reason. And I think that I want to see the Democratic Party own that, and also talk about it thoughtfully and not be afraid that Republicans are going to whine about later abortion and infanticide. They're always going to do that, whether it's an abortion ban at 6 weeks or 28 weeks. It doesn't matter. So the point is that we need to say, no, we stand behind abortion access for everyone, no matter what their reasoning is. And here's how we're going to make it accessible for everyone. I don't know if folks remember from the taco trucks on every corner. I want an abortion clinic truck, an abortion clinic, and all of that on every corner, because that means that people will not only get abortion care, but they will also get gender affirming care. That means that they will get preventative screening. It means they will get all of their gynecological and reproductive care. Because when you center abortion, it means that everyone else will be able to thrive.
Alice, what would you like to add?
I think that this is playing out both at the federal and state level in really interesting ways within the abortion rights movement. I mean, you have these state ballot measures that have proven one of the most effective tools of restoring or protecting or expanding abortion access after the fall of Roe v. Wade. And within several states, there's been this fight over, do we put forward a ballot measure that says go back to Roe, or do we put forward a ballot measure that imagines something broader and more expansive? And a lot of people fear that when people say, oh, our goal is to get the government out of people's healthcare and people's pregnancies, that's in conflict with a Roe framework, because Roe does allow government interference later in pregnancy and in some ways throughout pregnancy. But overwhelmingly in state after state, the Roe side of the debate has won out. And a lot of these ballot measures have these viability limits, including several of the ones that are set to be voted on this November. And so, I've been tracking how that's playing out at the state level, as well as this broader federal conversation that is happening right now at the DNC, where inside you have delegates voting on a platform that says specifically restore Roe, and outside the convention you have people marching in the streets saying that's not good enough.
You brought up a number of points there. We should say that yesterday, Montana became the 8th state with a ballot measure seeking to protect abortion rights. This is going to be so interesting to watch. You've got Maryland, Florida, South Dakota, Arizona, Missouri, Nevada, Colorado, voting on abortion. in November, taking it to the people, not the politicians. And we'll talk about Roe in a minute and what restoring Roe and going beyond that means. But first, I just want to talk about the bizarre comments, I don't even know what to call them, from Donald Trump about having an abortion at month 9 or killing the baby after the baby is born. And we have to play these clips because this guy's running for president again. And then J.D. Vance, if we can play clip 5. So J.D. Vance, this is a guy running for vice president on the Republican ticket. And he was asked about abortion at an event in Pennsylvania on Monday. And in this clip, he lies about abortion at 33 weeks of pregnancy. But this is what they're doing. And the other thing that's striking about this is, other than at the Black Journalist Conference, I don't really hear, I don't want to paint a broad brush, but when I hear Trump talking about abortion at 9 months or killing the baby, it's very rare to hear someone say that's not happening, but he keeps repeating it. And then I think we have that clip soon, clip 5. This is J.D. Vance at an event in Pennsylvania on Monday.
Here we go.
Rosemary Connors from NBC Philadelphia. Senator Vance, what's your message to Pennsylvania voters on abortion? Has your opinion changed? Do you think there should be a national ban? Or should it be left up to the states?
Look, it's okay. It's all right. It's all right. Look, first of all, I think it's important to be honest about what Donald Trump and I are focused on here. And what Donald Trump and I are focused on is making the American dream affordable again for Pennsylvania families. That is what we're focused on. Look, on the abortion question in particular, what President Trump has said has been very direct. And I think honestly he's tried to find some common ground in this country that has been divided by this question for 50 years. He said, look, Pennsylvania is going to want to have a different abortion policy from Ohio, which is going to want to have a different policy from California. Let the states decide. Let the people in those states decide. And I think it's important to point out just how different Donald Trump's common sense approach is from our opposition. Because these guys are talking about taxpayer-funded abortions up until the moment of birth. That is sick stuff. Whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, I think we can all agree that we do not need to have American taxpayers paying for abortion at 33 weeks of pregnancy. It's gross.
Okay, so there's J.D. Vance lying about pregnancy. According to KFF, abortions at or after 21 weeks are uncommon and represent 1% of all abortions in the United States. Reasons people seek abortions later in pregnancy include medical concerns such as fetal anomalies or maternal life endangerment, as well as barriers to care that cause delays in obtaining an abortion. That deserves a lot more attention. People who need abortions now are getting them later because they cannot access them. And if you want to learn more about abortions after 21 weeks, there's an amazing documentary called After Tiller. It is about the assassination of Dr. Tiller, George Tiller, in Wichita, Kansas. This happened in 2009, and it focuses on the amazing work that Dr. Tiller did and the complexities of women's difficult decisions to have abortions later in their pregnancies. Now, this is a really important issue to talk about because it's getting so much attention from the Republican side. And Alice, you tweeted, I thought this was such a good find for you. This was from, I believe it was the New York Times. They had a tweet that said, or a story that said 60% of abortions take place during the first trimester. And you pointed out pretty significant error in this Times story on abortion clinics. It's actually over 90%. And so we wonder why people are so confused about this.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to say they did run a correction, but often the people who see the initial wrong information don't always see the correction. So it's tough. But you're right. I mean, we're seeing misinformation coming from elected officials. We're seeing misinformation, errors in reporting, and from activist groups as well. And so, yeah, it's really important to point to the data on this. And, you know, when I was reporting the story about the tensions at the DNC around this idea of Restore Roe, I talked to several OBGYNs who perform abortions later in pregnancy, and they said that their views on this were informed by that work, that having seen many patients who, you know, got a really tough diagnosis late in pregnancy, or who had an abusive partner who wasn't letting them get an abortion earlier, and it took them months to figure out how to do it, or to save up for travel, et cetera. And so that's why, you know, having met those patients and heard those stories, that's why they say that this idea of going back to Roe versus Wade, where that could still happen, you know, they feel that doesn't meet the moment.
Right. Renee, what would you add?
Yeah, so we wrote about this in our forthcoming book, Liberating Abortion. We looked at actually the history of abortion, and you know, thousands of years ago, abortion's been around for 6,500 years, but truly up until about, you know, 150 years ago or so, anything that was considered an abortion was actually what we would consider a later abortion, because anything sort of before quickening, when the pregnant person can kind of first feel the fetus, was just sort of setting your body straight. It wasn't considered an abortion. An abortion was something after quickening. And so this idea of later abortion being this new thing, it's actually just because our language has really changed, and we can detect pregnancies earlier and earlier than we have for the majority of history. But the reason the anti-abortion movement focuses on it is this idea of kind of disgust. And as we write about, we cite the research at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Carol Jaffe does some research on disgust. And so there's this idea, if they can do this like horror film-esque description of what later abortion looks like, then they can make you, the listener, uncomfortable. And then you would be like, oh, I don't want to defend that, right? And then you're not willing to defend people who are the most vulnerable when they need an abortion. They don't want to have a conversation about why someone is having an abortion at 33 weeks. I live in Washington, D.C., where we have 4 of the last stop abortion clinics. They go into the 3rd trimester. So I take in, house, drive to the clinic, people who are coming from all across the country, red states, and yes, California too, because there isn't a lot of later abortion access in California. And the reasons that they have is, you know, the barriers that we've talked about. The Republicans don't want to have a conversation about the fact that the bans and barriers that they put in place are making it difficult for people to get the abortions that they want when they need them. So it does push them later in pregnancy. We also aren't having a conversation about they're pushing sex ed out of school. They're pushing healthcare classes out of school. People don't necessarily know how their bodies work. I've met people who are having abortions late in the 20 weeks or into early 30 weeks because they literally didn't know they were pregnant. And when they went to the hospital to get care for the body pains they were having, no one actually gave them a pregnancy test or diagnosed them as pregnant. Wow. And so then to find out in the, let's say, late 20 weeks or maybe even early 30 weeks that you're pregnant and try to get an abortion, it is a rat race. And these are sometimes folks who live actually near a later abortion clinic. And so we shame them for needing the care and then also make it really, really difficult. And the anti-abortion movement wants to make you uncomfortable. So you isolate these people instead of surrounding them with the love and care that they need and say, how do we actually fix the system so that people can get the abortions that they want when they want them? And if they need abortions later in pregnancy, that they are met with kindness and dignity and support. It shouldn't be this dehumanizing experience. But that means that we have to push Democrats and anyone who considers them pro-choice to really challenge your thoughts on later abortion and join us in the call for abortion at any time and for any reason, because those folks who need later abortions know what's best for themselves and we should be doing nothing but supporting them and caring for them.
Renee, do you know, are Democrats talking about sex education, given how important it is and what is happening to sex education in certain parts of the country?
Not really. It's something we write about this in our book, Liberating Abortion, too. We have a whole chapter on kind of the history of sex ed. It became super, super politicized. We write about when Jocelyn Elders talked about masturbation and she was forced to step down as the Secretary General for under the Clinton administration, right? Like there is this fear of talking about sex, which comes out in the abortion stories that get lifted up, right? They're not like people who just were having sex and got pregnant and needed an abortion. We're sort of still this bit of puritanical, afraid of talking about sex. I would like them to talk about sex ed more, but I think it's one of those challenges because it becomes this fodder for conservatives that are like, they're trying to talk to your kids about sex, and it becomes this parent issue instead of actually having a real conversation about, actually most parents don't know information when it comes to sex, and that's why it's awkward in talking with their kids. And that we should have a larger, healthy conversation about health and sex ed and trans inclusive health, like queer and trans folks and their sexuality, like all of these things. But we allow this fear of telling kids about it instead of having a real conversation about what does it mean to talk with young children about their bodies and consent and good touch, bad touch. And it's okay if, you have feelings for someone who is the same gender as you. Like you maybe you don't feel like who you are in your body. It's okay to explore those thoughts, that we teach them to be confident people. But conservatives don't want to have that conversation because they know that it is a gateway to a larger conversation about changing the world and making sure that everyone feels loved and supported. I would love to see Democrats take that conversation on. There's an amazing organization called Educate Us. Jacqueline Friedman leads it, and I'm on the advisory board, and she's working with politicians to get better sex ed policies across the country. And so folks should really check out Educate Us.
Renee Bracey Sherman's book, Liberating Abortion, comes out in October. She co-authored the book. She's founder and executive director of We Testify. We're also joined by Alice Ollstein, healthcare reporter with Politico. Alice, in our remaining minutes, can you tell us, if Kamala Harris wins in November, what would it mean to restore Roe? What would that look like? I mean, the Democrats would have to win the Senate and the House, right?
Right. So we point out in our reporting that, this is largely a messaging conversation because it is very unlikely that there will be the votes in Congress to either restore Roe or pass something more sweeping that restores abortion access throughout pregnancy. Such bills have been introduced and have gone nowhere. We have a very divided Congress, and that is not likely to change, although you never know. And so a lot of what we've seen is what can happen on the executive branch and what can happen at the state level, what can happen in the courts. That is where we're largely focused. But there is still this fight over this restore Roe language because it's, people feel that it's necessary to put forward a vision for what Democrats could do in power. And there's a lot of disagreements about what that vision should be, even if, she can send whatever bill she wants to Congress, the chances are not good.
So that means then, again, it's all about the states. Renee, what are your thoughts? I mean, what's so horrible about this is if you live in Texas or any other state where abortion is banned, I mean, at this point, your option is you might have access to pills if you know about them or to travel.
Yes, but I think our people need to know about their local abortion funds. I think that folks need to know that there are resources out there. If you don't know what an abortion fund, it's a community-based organization where they're helping folks get to their abortions, get connected with all the work, whatever they need to those wraparound services to get their abortions. I also think that I lived in the Bay Area for 4 years, and I've definitely heard folks kind of be like, oh, those poor people in Texas. Show up for them, like do the work, make sure, donate to organizations, because those Texans and everyone in those red states, those organizers are some of the fiercest I've ever met in my life. And they are working around the clock to make sure that people can get their abortions either in their communities or if they travel. I also think that don't just rest on your laurels and assume we're in California that it's fine, right? Like I said earlier, I live in DC, and I've taken care of people who've had to travel out of California to Washington, DC to get abortions because they could not get the care that they needed. So put the pressure on Gavin Newsom that you need to be able to make sure that folks are getting abortions beyond 24 weeks. If you live in LA, DuPont Clinic is trying to open a clinic in Beverly Hills, but the Beverly Hills City Council is stopping them from doing it. That should not be happening in California. So don't think that just because the red states are having trouble that you're fine in California. You have a growing anti-abortion opposition, and you need to nip that in the bud right now so that we don't get to the point where you guys are having ballot initiatives actually challenging the access that you have. You need to keep going to make sure every single person in California is able to get the abortions that they need, and be welcoming and supporting for all of the neighboring states, for folks who are coming from the places where they aren't getting the care that they need. I think that you guys have a lot of work to do in California, and I can't wait to see you do it.
Well, thank you for bringing up that story about Beverly Hills. If anyone wants to learn more about that, just search Abortion Clinic Beverly Hills. Renee Bracey Sherman is founder and executive director of We Testify. The book she co-authored, Liberating Abortion, comes out in October. Alice Ollstein is healthcare reporter for Politico. You can find her piece, Harris Wants to Restore Roe. For many activists, that's not enough. It's on our website, kalw.org. Click news and then your call. Alice, thank you so much for your reporting. We'd love to have you back. Renee, thank you for joining us, and we'd love to have you on when your book comes out.
Yes, please. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to Savannah Harriman-Pote for producing today's show. Thanks to Kevin Vance for engineering our show. You can find all of our past shows at kalw.org. Click news and then your call. And if you're listening on KALW, be sure to tune in tonight and tomorrow night at 6 p.m. We will be live bringing you coverage from the Democratic National Convention. We will also take your calls and emails. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.